so he can start to walk you through the data collected for end of year 2.
Let's now discuss the data requirements for end of year 2. Here's a high-level summary of the data collected for EY2. LEAs are expected to submit the SCNR, SDM, CRSC, SCSC, SCTE, and WBLR for EY2. End of year 2 staff demo, course and student course submission is a separate and unrelated submission to Fall 2. So LEAs do not need to account for the same staff requirements or business rules that were expected during the Fall 2 submission. And to facilitate with the collection of end of year 2 data, CalPAS coordinators must work with site staff, administrators, program staff, and the CTE folks. So on a more granular level, EY2 data would include the student enrollment, which includes the enrollment which allows you to gain ownership to report supporting records. It also provides you the exit information, which will be used for the 1 year graduation and completers data collection. The SDM will include the seed and, of course, identify the teacher associated to a course. The course completion will include the state course codes, course attributes, which, for example, are your APIB indicators or courses, your college credit courses, whether or not a course met a UCCSU requirement, and if a CTE course is taught by a highly qualified CTE teacher. It also indicates whether or not a CTE course is an articulated course or not. On the student course completion side, it includes the AG requirements, credits earned, grades earned, the Carnegie units earned, as well as whether or not a student may be a CTE participant or a CTE completer based on the associated state course code of the class that the student completed for that CTE course. And then we also have the SCTE file, which includes the actual pathway code and the completer year. The work-based learning will include the work-based learning types, internship attributes, and the hours of work. And as I mentioned, end of year 2 will also now include the 1 year graduation and completers count, which will identify students who are graduates and completers in this current reporting period. Even though it is not directly reported, this collection will also be contribute to the 4 year cohort since some of the student enrollment information will be attributed to the 4 year cohort collection. Your SENR will also include the seal of biliteracy, the Golden State Seal, and the AG completion indicators. Although CalPAS now allows submission of files all at once or out of sequence, we will still recommend LAs follow the sequence laid out in this diagram. You will want to ensure that the SCNR and SDM records are up to date in CalPAS before submitting any of the other file types. The SCNR will give you ownership to report the student course completion and, if applicable, student career technical education and work-based learning data. The SDM will include the seed that is also assigned to course completion to identify the teacher for the course. The course, on the other hand, will have the course section ID that connects it to the SCSC record, while it also has the state course code that will link it to a capstone course that is associated to a CT pathway that is linked to the student career technical education. So also bear in mind that some of these files, particularly the course section completion, student course section completion, and student career technical education are all replacement files, meaning it may overwrite existing records once you introduce a new file into the system. So please bear in mind all of the operational keys that will be used to overwrite files. This file reporting matrix provides guidance on what schools and grade levels are required or expected to have EOY2 related data submitted to CalPADS. You have here the different school types, grade levels, and the different file types, and whether or not it is a required field for specific schools, or if it's just permitted, or if it is not expected or not required at all. To simplify the matrix, do not report EOY2 data for grades TK to 8 that are in self-contained classes. However, grades 7 and 8 in departmentalized courses may be reported to CalPADS. However, it's optional. Should you not report these courses, you may get an SENR 0713E2 warning if you opt not to submit the data, but you may ignore that and just go ahead and certify the appropriate reports that you find accurate down the road. On the other hand, you report grades 9 to 12 that are in departmentalized courses. Again, you have to submit SDM, CRSC, SCSC, and Wobbler data for these students and for those specific schools. The SCSC record should only be reported for students who completed the course. So there are instances when students may only have stayed or enrolled at a specific school for a short amount of time and therefore have not completed the whole span of a course, then obviously they won't have any grades for that. And so these are some of the students that don't need to be reported in CalPADS. And then of course for SCTE, you only submit a SCTE record for students who have been determined to be CTE pathway completers in this current academic year. Let's move on into discussing individual file types collected in end of year 2, beginning with course section and student course section completion records. LAs must submit information on courses that students have completed during the year in the CRSC and SCSC records. Most course completion data is only required for students in departmentalized classroom settings in grades 9 to 12 attending traditional schools. So grades, credits attempted, and credits earned are all required for grades levels 9 to 12. When reporting grade level 7 to 8, you only report grades earned. However, this is an optional reporting requirement. So again, grade 7 to 8 is just optional. So you really don't need to report those student subgroups in CalPADS for end of year 2. So just a reminder, you must submit student course completion data for all official grading periods for the entirety of the school year. By submitting course completion data for students in departmentalized courses in grades 9 to 12, LAs are also able to identify CTE participants. So this guide contains key fields or attributes in the CRSC record. There are 4 key attributes to be mindful of when populating data and reviewing EOY2 aggregate reports in CalPADS. They are course content, high-quality CTE courses, CTE attributes, and college courses. So let's start with course content. So this includes state course codes, identify CTE course completions, college course completion, and military science courses. For college courses, there are a subset of college courses that are identified through specific state course codes designating college level courses. On the other hand, college level courses can also be identified based on the non-standard instructional level 23 and which is college credit only or 24 dual enrollment, and this is applicable only to CTE state course codes. So for the high quality CTE courses developed with CTE pathway standards, So these standards are designed to develop high-quality curriculum and instruction that help ensure that students are career and college ready. These standards offer clear guidelines for course content development and expectations for student achievement. These standards are not exclusive to a career pathway, ACT program of study, a particular discipline, or a level of education. High-quality CTE courses must be taught by a credentialed CTE teacher. So this requirement is in compliance with the expectation when receiving CTE IG funding or Carl Perkins funding. So when a school that is in a CTE pathway program is receiving CTE IG funded um, money or Perkins funded money, it is expected that those schools hire high quality CTE credentialed teachers. And then for the CTE attributes, students reported to a CTE capstone course who are pathway completers will also be identified as a completer in your 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate and will be included in calculations for the CCI on the California School Dashboard. All right, so there are different ways in reporting college courses. Again, LA should report college courses that students complete with a C minus or better or passing, as it is one of the factors used in determining whether students are prepared for college career on the CCI. LA should indicate in the course section record that courses are college level by using the appropriate college course code. So as I mentioned earlier, you can identify a course as a college course by picking a subset of courses that are essentially specific to college credit courses. On the other hand, for a college credit CTE course, you have to identify the CTE state course code and then use the course section level instruction code with either 23 or 24. 23 meaning college credit only, or 24 dual credit. LEA should only report a course as dual enrollment or college credit only if the students earn college credit upon completion. The student may earn high school credit in addition, but the student must also earn college credit. If LEAs do not have seeds and staff information for college teachers, LEA should submit a seed of 9999, 10 nines, for the teachers in this course section records. Bear in mind, the Fall 2 data requirement for assignment monitoring do not bear any weight in end of year 2 collection. So any staff member, any seed number, may it be valid seed or a seed 999, is accepted as long as you have a staff demographic record for those valid seed courses. For courses that are assigned a seed 999, you don't need to submit a staff demographic record for those. So again, data submitted in the CRSC and SCSC files as part of the EOY2 submission are used to identify whether students in the 4-year adjusted cohort graduate rate are prepared for college as measured by the CCI on the California School Dashboard. So again, the CCI looks at state course codes in the 900 series range that's specific to college credit courses or any of the CTE course codes indicated with a non-standard instructional level of 23 or 24. So let's now talk about AP and IB courses. So LEA should designate state course code values for advanced placement or international baccalaureate courses. So AP courses should have the appropriate state course code selected and aligned with a specific content area. IB courses must be reported with the appropriate state course code unless they are middle school IB courses. So for middle school IB courses, use the course instructional level field to indicate that it's an IB course. So the key takeaway here is that AP courses and IB courses can be identified using a specific state course code appropriate for those courses. Now, with regards to AP IB courses that are also CTE courses, you have to identify the course by picking the appropriate state course code associated to that CTE course. So you have to identify the CTE state course code, and then to identify that the CTE course is also an AP or IB course, you have to then identify the appropriate AP IB course code reference indicator, whether or not it's an international baccalaureate for language A or whatever appropriate content area is for that APIB course. Again, when reporting CTE courses, it is expected that you pick this appropriate CTE state course code, indicate if that course is an articulated course, and then identify whether or not it is being taught by a highly qualified CTE instructor. I believe this CTE course provider code is no longer a required field or an expected field, so this can be left blank. So this slide contains key fields or attributes in the SCSE record. Again, there are 4 key attributes to be mindful of when populating SCSE records and reviewing associated EOY2 aggregate reports in CalPADS. They are grades, credits, Carnegie units, and the UCCSU admission requirement code. So for grades should be populated with the final grade a student received after completing a specific course section and are only required for departmentalized courses for students grades 9 to 12. 7 to 8 is also required. However, since reporting 7 to 8 graders are optional, then this may not bear some workload on your submission. LEA should not submit progress report grades, but only grades earned when credits are awarded. For credits, this is required for grades 9 to 12. LEAs may submit course completion data either after the completion of an official grading period in which credits are awarded or at the end of the year when students have completed all courses for the school year. Next is the Carnegie units. In addition to credits earned, students' progress and achievement will be derived from the SCSE record via the Carnegie unit. Again, the Carnegie unit is granted to a student completing approximately 120 hours of class in one subject over the course of 1 year. A total of 120 hours in one subject, meeting 4 or 5 times a week or for 40 to 60 minutes or for 36 to 40 weeks each year, earns the student 1 Carnegie unit of high school credit. So if there are 2 semester courses should equal 1 year long. A year-long course constitutes 1 Carnegie unit. A semester course is halved, so you have 0.5 for semester 1 and another 0.5 for semester 2. But your SIS will be able to compute this in the background so you don't have to sweat over the calculation of these units. Lastly, you have your UCCSU admission requirement code. Okay, this represents the University of California or CSU college admission course requirements that a high school course has been determined to meet. So we have a listing of possible course values in the CalPADS code sets. So you may want to refer to that. So this is not a required field, but it should be populated for courses that have been approved by the UCCSU institutions. This field is only applicable for, again, departmentalized courses in grades 9 to 12. So let's now look at the different components of the student course section record. So these following fields are required in the SCSC for end of year. Okay, so number 1 is the academic term code. So this represents the period of time into which the educational institution divides the academic year for the purpose of instruction. So essentially, if you have a course that's a full year course but broken into 2 semesters, then you'll have an S1 for the first semester and S2 for second semester. Please bear in mind that you have to have a matching academic term code between the CRSC and the SCSC, since this is normally the reason why LEAs would encounter the SCSC 0139E2 error, wherein an SCSC record was submitted. However, there was no matching CRSE record in file. Even though the CRSE record is there are times when the academic term code is the culprit, where the CRSC may contain a full year, while the SCSC will contain S1 or S2. So just bear in mind of that nuance. Next one is student credits attempted. So again, these are count of credits attempted for a specific course section in grades 9 to 12. Normally, it's 3 credits for the whole year. And then you have your 3 student credits earned. This is basically the actual credits earned after completion. And then you have your student course final grade, which is any value. It could be alphanumeric. Bear in mind that, again, this should reflect the final grade and not the performance reporting grade during the year. And then you have your UCCSU admission requirement, which indicates whether or not this course met that requirement. And then, of course, you have your Carnegie units earned, which is basically 1 Carnegie unit if the course was completed for the whole year. All right, now that we've concluded our discussion on the SCSC record, let's now turn to the SCTE file, or the Student Career Technical Education file. So LAs must submit information on CTE pathways that students have completed during the year. Students who have completed a CTE pathway during the reporting year are included in the Student Career Technical Education file. If a student has completed more than one pathway during the reporting year, a record is included for each completed pathway. So I mean, if you have a overachiever and the student completed 2 pathways during this reporting year, by all means report 2 SCTE records reflecting the CTE pathway code for that pathway program the student completed. If a student has completed, again, more than one pathway, you have to report that to CalPEDS. So CTE participants who are non-completers are not included in the SCTE file, as the data collected for course sections and student course sections include the information needed to identify them. So again, if let's say a student just completed a capstone course, but is not participating in a pathway program, you should not submit an SCTE record for that student, since probably the student only took that course as a elective, or the student may have taken the course out of sequence. So again, the SCTE file provides us with the SCTE completer information, identifying students who have completed a minimum of 300 hours in a state-approved CTE pathway. So this information is self-reported by the LEA. So the LEA should, the CalPAS coordinator and the CTE coordinator, as well as the teacher or the counselor should be able to identify who are the CTE pathway completers this year locally by determining the requirements locally, if they met the minimum 300 hours, and if they've completed the sequence of pathways. If that is the case, then that's the only time that you identify a student as a CTE pathway completer. The SCTE file also indicates the pathways of completers as well as the completer's completion year. Okay, so it will indicate the specific industry pathway that the student completed. And since you are reporting that the student completed the pathway this year, then you should also identify the completion year, since this will be matched with the year that the capstone course was completed. Again, the SCTE is a relatively small file but provides key data elements for the California School Dashboard and feeds into the post-secondary status submission. Right, so let's see what are the CTE student subgroups, okay? So you have here the CTE participant, which is the bigger circle. A CTE participant is a student who has completed the equivalent of a conventional 50-minute class taken 5 times per week for 180 school days, or approximately 150 hours of instruction in a state-recognized CTE pathway. So the CD counts as a participant any student who has completed a CTE course. So this includes your CTE non-completers and your CTE pathway completers. So your CTE non-completer participant is a student who has completed a CTE course who may or may not be participating in a pathway but does not meet the definition of a CTE completer. So a CTE completer participation is reported and determined through just the CRSC record and the SCSC record that reflects the completion. Now for a CTE completer, a CTE completer is identified locally and is a student who has completed a sequence of CTE designated courses within the pathway and has successfully passed the capstone course in that sequence with a grade of C- or better. So to distinguish a CTE completer from a non-completer, the LEA must report 3 file types: the CRSC that reflects the capstone course, the SCSC that reflects um, the completion of that capstone course by the student, and it would also include a grade of C- or higher, and the SCTE record that reflects that the student completed a specific pathway in this current academic year associated to that capstone course. All right, this slide provides a visual explanation for how CT participants and pathway completers are reported in CalPADS. So let's begin with the CT non-completer participant. So here you have your CRSC file, which reflects the CT state course code. Okay, so it could be any CTE state course code. It could be an intro course, a middle course, or a capstone course. Okay, and then of course you submit the SCSC record of the student that would reflect that the student completed that course. So you have your SCSC student completion for that specific course. For a non-completer, obviously since the student is not participating in a pathway program, or if the student has not completed all the levels of an SCTE pathway, the LA must not submit an SCTE record. Okay, so because this is the distinction between a pathway completer and a non-completer. So speaking of a pathway completer, you again report the same information. The only difference this time is that the CRSC and the SCSC should be associated to a state course code that's identified as the capstone course. Okay. So once you've identified that the student completed the entire program and completed the capstone course, this year with a C minus or higher. You then submit the SCTE record, which identifies the appropriate CTE pathway that this capstone course and series of courses are associated to. You also must include the academic year, and it should reflect the academic year when the capstone course was completed. And this is again assuming the student completed the pathway in the proper sequence or step ladder sequence. And so, with that assumption, the academic year should be equal to this current reporting year. All right, a common problem in end of year 2 reporting is that CT state course codes are mapped to the wrong pathway. So CT pathways and CT state course codes should be mapped so that they align with the content of the curriculum. So the valid code combination document, which Nate showed us earlier, contains the mapping for those CTE courses. So if you go to the course group master combo tab, this one here, it will identify the state course codes and the appropriate CTE pathway that they're under. It also identifies whether a course is a capstone course. Okay. And then there are some information wherein the CTE may have a sub pathway. Okay. There are some CTE pathways where you have a sub pathway. So LEAs must determine the specific pathway that a student is enrolled in. So the key element here is that if you are telling us that a course is in the correct pathway, you have to identify, again, the CT pathway code, identify the different step ladder state course codes, and then identify, number one, students are expected to follow the sequence throughout their pathway program. There are times, though, that for some reason students may have to follow this out of sequence, meaning maybe the concentrator was ahead of the intro, or concentrator course was after the student first finished the capstone course. So in such cases, it is important that you align the reporting of the capstone course as to when the pathway program is completed, meaning the pathway program was not completed in the proper sequence and you attempt to report SCTE record completion in this current year, you also have to again report the CTE capstone course in the year that you are telling us that the student is a CTE completer. All right, this slide shows where in the CRSC is a capstone is identified. So again, you have here the student is a CT pathway completer this year, 25-26, with a CT pathway code of 100. So the expectation is CalPADS will look at the capstone course reported this year as well. So let's say if a student was reported as a completer this year for 100, then the student should be enrolled and should have completed with a grade of C minus or better a state course code of 7112, which is Advanced Agricultural Business or capstone course. So it is important that you report the capstone completion in the same year that you're reporting the student as a CT pathway completer. So now for non-CT completers, this slide shows the fields or data elements that CalPADS uses to determine a CT non-completer participant. So the SCSC record for non-completer participants must use a state course code that identifies the course as a CTE introduction or concentrator course. So since we're talking about graphics here, if a student only completed the intro course of 7210 or 7211, the middle course, then this is identified as a non-completer. You're not supposed to submit an SCTE record telling us that the student is a CTE completer for graphic design. All right, that concludes our discussion for SCTE. So I'll pass on the mic to Nate to discuss the work-based learning report.
Okay, so now let's talk about work-based learning. LEAs that provide instruction to grades 9 through 12 should also submit data related to work-based learning. This data can be used for the CCI and the California School Dashboard. There are 12 work-based learning types that can be submitted, and the work-based learning uses a full replacement processing file. So here we have the 12 work-based learning types: internship, student-led enterprise, simulated work-based learning, registered apprenticeship program, Job Corps, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, Youth Build, California Conservation Corps, transition work-based experience, and transition classroom-based experience. Now, these 12 work-based measures can be found on the CDE's website under work-based learning measures for the CCI. That is what CalPADS is collecting, and you can see descriptions and definitions for each type. Internships require the most data with several conditional fields. Student-led enterprise simulated work-based learning have a conditional field that's similar to internship, but just one. The rest of the work-based learning types require minimal data. Job Corps, Youth Build, and the California Conservation Corps are either federal or state programs. Transition work-based experience and transition classroom-based work exploration are specific to students with disabilities, and often you have to consult the special education department for this information. So here we have a screenshot of the work-based learning module in CalPADS, and you can see field 2109 is the work-based learning type code. This is where you input one of the 12 work-based learning types. If it's an internship, the remaining fields indicated in the screenshot are required. So you would have to populate an internship ID, work-based learning external hours, state course code, embedded work-based learning, internship performance evaluation code, internship certificated supervisor indicator, internship LEA sponsor indicator. Let's go through some of these fields. So there are 3 types of work-based learning that requires the state course code, field 2112. We've already mentioned internship, but also student-led enterprise and simulated work-based learning require a state course code to identify. Internships, the state course code has to be either a CTE state course code or work experience education state course code, while simulated work-based learning and student-led enterprise can be any state course code. Now, internship ID, that just identifies which internship the student is taking within your local system. The work-based learning hours external represent the grading period or the entire academic year, depending on how your system is set up. The internship employer performance evaluation code. So if the student has an internship, the employer should be providing an evaluation, just like traditional job. The internship certificated supervisor indicator, if the internship was facilitated through the school, a certificated supervisor, so a teacher, probably the instructor of the course that's related to the internship, would be a yes. If it wasn't provided through the school, it could be a no. And then the internship LEA sponsor indicator. If the school assisted the student in finding the internship or facilitated it, this is a yes or no value. So the work-based learning data is going to be used specifically for the CCI. And on the CDE web portal, several of the measures are potential, right? So you can see these are potential new measures. The data is still being collected and evaluated. So it's very worthwhile to submit the data. And the expectation, if you are providing internship, student-led enterprise, or simulated work-based learning, that you would provide that information. Right now, the work-based learning file has very little validations. And as the collection increases and the value to the CDE increases, you can expect more validations. It's a pretty small file, and relatively easy to submit. The challenge comes in the data collection, right? So identifying which one of your courses is providing work-based learning experience, whether it's CTE, a STEM course, or your special education department. You have to reach out and make sure that they're submitting the data. I have a son who is just started a CTE program. He's describing they're simulating clocking in and taking breaks during the classroom in addition to the instruction. So I would assume, I don't know this for certain, that he's in a simulated work-based learning course. It's a traditional CTE course, and I think to make sure that students are getting that work-based learning experience, they're simulating the work environment. If you have a scenario like that at your school, you want to make sure that the students are receiving, credit for that, or if it can be implemented in your school, you can go back to your administration, your curriculum instruction, and describe how work-based learning could be added to the traditionally offered programs. All right, so we're going to transition into the one-year graduates and completers report. Understand that your graduates are identified in your student enrollment file. The exit code E230 identifies students that are completers, and then your completion status code will identify graduates. Traditionally, 100 is standard graduate. For students with disabilities, 102 can also identify students who are graduate. The one-year graduates and completer count was formerly in end of year 3, which is now end of year 1. Now, the one-year graduates and completer count is part of end of year 2. Fifth and sixth year seniors or early graduates are identified. This is different than the cohort report. So let's talk about the inclusion of one-year graduates and completers to end of year 1. This data was previously collected in end of year 3 and was moved to end of year 2 this year because the graduates and completer data has symmetry with the rest of end of year 1 being exclusive to grades 9 through 12. It also allows us to marry the cohort data pool and the one-year grad pool together. So the benefit of the one-year grad report is that early graduates and late graduates, like six-year seniors, are represented in counts that the LEA can see. This data is publicly available on DataQuest. So remember that your graduate data comes from the student enrollment file. When you complete your exits, you're going to identify those completers, that's the E230 exit, and your graduates. That's either state course code 100, or for students with disabilities, it can also be the alternative pathway of state course code 102. Those are the students that you will see as graduates. The rest of your completers will depend on your completion status, but all the students on this report will have an E230 exit reason. No additional data needs to be submitted. Only the students exited at the end of year. When you have completed your exits, your report will comprise a list of graduates. Okay, so let's have a checklist of the things that we need to complete, right? Let's review this. Report all courses. Make sure all your courses are mapped to the correct state course code, whether it's a CTE or another additional academic course. You want to make sure that you appropriately map all your state course codes. The CalPADS code set provides the definitions. Map the definitions based to the content, not the title. Populate all required fields for your courses. So your content subcategory code, your standards, grade range, all those other fields. What's most important for end of year, other than mapping your state course code, is identifying your CTE courses with a 23 or 24 if they provide college credit, right? That's what's most important. Make sure that you've translated credits to Carnegie units. So if you use one of the more expensive and popular student information systems, this will be done automatically. If you are working outside of a student information system, you will have to do this yourself. Make sure that you have identified your CTE completers in your SIS, the leadership military science courses and the students who have received them, the seal of biliteracy and go to state seal recipients. Identify that in your student enrollment file. Identify students who have completed college credits, and identify all those students who have completed work-based learning throughout the academic year. When you talk about work-based learning, Identify those internships. Make sure you populate all the required fields like the internship ID, work-based learning hours, performance evaluation code, if the LEA sponsored the course, or if the course was supervised by a certificated teacher. If it's a work-based learning student-led enterprise or a virtual simulated work-based learning type, make sure that we have populated the work-based learning hours and the state course code. Remember, there are restrictions to state course code for internships. It has to be a CTE state course code or work experience education. And with student-led enterprise or virtual simulated work-based learning, any state course code is acceptable. And then last but not least, ensure that all your graduates and completers are accounted for. So remember, the difference between the 4-year cohort and the 1-year report is the 4-year cohort is based on the time in which the student entered their 9th grade year, that initial 9th grade entry. The 1-year completer is identifying all students regardless of when they started, early or late, when they exited, I should say, not when they started. So it could be your 3-year grad, it could be a 5th or 6-year senior. If they graduate or complete, they're going to be on the report.